Hi, I'm Althea. My family said I was too intense and too late, too much. They laughed when I walked in, poured drinks over toasts that never included me, and gave away heirlooms I was promised, right in front of my face. But the worst part? They erased me from the will. They called me complicated. My own brother called me lost and late, while standing beside the woman wearing my necklace. Then one day, a letter arrived, from someone I thought was dead. Why would a mother who supposedly vanished send a message from beyond? And what happens when you dig up a truth they buried just to keep you silent? I was already 15 minutes late by the time my boots touched the marble steps of the Denver Country Club. It was my brother's engagement party. Judson, the golden boy, the good son, the one who stayed close to home and made everyone proud. I hadn't even had time to change out of my navy blue blazer and slacks. My hair was still damp from the rushed motel shower. My fingers were trembling, clutching the gift envelope like it could excuse my absence. The valet gave me a tight smile as I handed over my car keys. I walked in. Every eye turned. The chandelier above the ballroom glinted like it was mocking me. I caught the faint chime of champagne flutes pausing mid-toast, and I froze in the entryway. I could feel the heat crawl up my neck as a woman in a sequined gown gave me a once-over, whispering something to her husband. This wasn't unfamiliar. This wasn't even uncomfortable anymore. It was just routine. I scanned the room until I spotted them, my parents near the grand piano, pretending they didn't see me. Judson stood at the center of a semicircle of guests, one arm wrapped tightly around his bride-to-be, whose name I still stumbled on. Madeline. Marissa. I think it was Miranda. I started walking toward them, one careful step after another, my heels catching slightly on the plush carpet. My brother's eyes locked on mine. He smirked. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, lifting his champagne glass. "Look who finally made it. Right on military time, huh?" The crowd chuckled politely. I forced a smile and waved weakly, nodding to no one in particular. I wanted to shrink into my blazer, melt into the floral wallpaper, disappear into the white linens and gold trim. I shouldn't have come. The last time I saw Judson, it was over a video call. I was in Kuwait, treating a shrapnel wound on a 12-year-old boy while he complained about Miranda's bridal registry. Priorities. I made my way to the back of the room, near the dessert table, and reached for a glass of water. My mother glanced at me, then quickly looked away, pretending to be deeply interested in the pianist's rendition of Can't Help Falling in Love. Typical. I missed the rehearsal dinner, not because I didn't care, but because I was rerouted mid-flight due to an emergency landing in Chicago. They knew that. Nobody acknowledged it. Just like the holidays I missed, birthdays, Dad's retirement, all washed under the tide of Judson's perfect attendance record. He cleared his throat and raised his glass again. "I'd like to toast," he said, "to Miranda, who not only said yes but also had the patience to deal with every single hiccup along the way, including my habit of being on time. Unlike some people, I guess we just value punctuality more than national duty." Laughter. Louder this time. My jaw tightened. I sipped my water. My fists clenched under the tablecloth. I remembered sitting alone on Christmas Eve 3 years ago, eating cold chow from a field pack, watching fireworks light up a foreign sky, while back home they probably didn't even set a place for me at the table. Maybe they thought I liked being forgotten. Then it happened. A gasp from the front of the room. Miranda's mother, Dolores, I remembered now, collapsed mid-toast. Her wine glass shattered on the floor as she crumpled like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Screams, chair scraping, panic spreading like a gas leak. And me, I moved. Years of training kicked in. My heels were gone before I hit the floor, kneeling beside her, fingers checking pulse, eyes scanning pupils, voice calm as I barked instructions to bystanders. "Call 911. Tell them she's unconscious and possibly had a cardiac episode." "She's not breathing!" someone screamed. I tilted her head back, began CPR compressions. 30 counts. Breath. Again. Gasps. A hush. Then the distant wail of a siren. I didn't even notice Judson standing behind me until the paramedics arrived. One of them tapped my shoulder, eyes wide. "She's stable," I whispered. "But she needs an EKG now." They took over. I stood up, hands trembling slightly, trying to hide the adrenaline crash. Everyone stared. The same faces that laughed at me minutes ago now looked like they'd seen a ghost. Dolores's husband rushed forward, gripping my arm. "You saved her life," he said, eyes moist. "Thank you, miss." "Althea," I answered quietly. Judson and my parents stood rooted in place. No one spoke. I walked toward the bathroom, pushed the door open, locked it behind me, turned on the tap. The mirror stared back. I looked at the woman in the reflection, calm, stoic, hollow. Why did they only see me when I was useful? Why did I keep showing up? I wiped my hands on a paper towel, stared at the drain for a long time, and whispered to myself, for once, I didn't want to save them, but I did. The ballroom looked softer now, bathed in the warm, flickering glow of votive candles and chandeliers dimmed to just above romantic. I stepped out from the restroom, hands still damp despite the towel, and paused. Everything felt louder. Clinking silverware, murmured conversations, the soft laugh of someone trying too hard to seem unbothered. My heels clicked against the polished floor, drawing glances. Not the kind from before, not the judgmental once-over reserved for the late and underdressed. No, this time they were different. Curious, hesitant, reverent maybe. But admiration doesn't always come with a seat. I searched for a familiar face, a gesture, an outstretched hand, something that said, "We see you now," nothing. I moved through the space like a ghost, untouched. They watched me as though I might resurrect another life at any moment, like I was a miracle, not a person. I passed a table where two women I vaguely remembered from Judson's college years whispered behind their wine glasses, eyes following me like they couldn't decide if they wanted to thank me or avoid me entirely. 15 minutes ago, they were laughing at a jab about my punctuality issues. Now their smiles were laced with guilt. Guilt rarely comes with action. The head table came into view, a long, elevated spread of white linen and gold-trimmed name cards. I looked for mine. Between Judson and our parents were the expected names, his fiancé, her beaming father, an empty chair for her mother. There was a space at the end. I walked toward it, then the waiter intercepted me. "Miss Matheson?" he asked, polite but clearly rehearsed. "You've been moved to the overflow seating. This way, please." Overflow, I blinked. "I'm family," I said, softer than I meant. "Yes, ma'am, right this way." I saw Judson over the waiter's shoulder. He raised a champagne flute at me, smiling like a man who'd just made a practical joke and was waiting for the laugh. "You'll be more comfortable there anyway," he called. "Closer to the bar." The guests around him chuckled. I didn't. I followed the waiter in silence, weaving past tables of extended cousins and friends of the bride. He stopped near the swinging doors of the kitchen, at a small round table wedged awkwardly behind a floral column. A toddler in a high chair banged a spoon next to me. My seat had a partial view of a busboy's tray stacked with used napkins. I sat. I didn't bother adjusting my dress this time. Let the wrinkles show. Let the half-eaten cake stain the edge of the tablecloth. They'd already seated me like a leftover. For a moment, I tried to eat. The salad arrived, limp and overdressed. But what caught my eye wasn't the wilted spinach. It was the name card. Tucked neatly under the lip of my plate, written in delicate cursive, was a half-truth. A. Matheson. Not right. Not the name I carried into battle zones and back. Not the hyphen I kept after the divorce because I'd earned every letter of it. Just Matheson, a fragment, no rank, no captain, no medic, no history. It felt like erasure. Casual. Clean. I stared at it long enough for the waiter to ask if something was wrong. I smiled and shook my head. Then I picked up the card, folded it in half with careful fingers, and slipped it into my clutch. A souvenir. "They can shrink my name," I whispered to no one. "But they don't get to shrink me." I pushed my chair back. The metal legs squealed against the floor. Not loud, but enough to make heads turn. I stood just as the MC tapped his mic. "Family toast in 5 minutes," he called. "Please gather around the head table." I didn't move toward it, but I didn't sit back down either. The MC's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the front for a special toast." My shoes clicked softly against the polished wood floor as I made my way back toward the main table, hovering just outside the circle of family and well-heeled friends gathered in a semicircle around Garrick. He stood confidently under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers, a half-smile tugging at his lips, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a champagne flute. I hovered just outside the warm light pooling around the family table, my clutch still tucked under one arm, fingers cold even in the temperature-controlled room. The murmur of guests softened to quiet expectancy. Everyone was watching Garrick, and no one saw me. Trays of champagne flutes floated by, carried by polished servers in black ties. I stepped forward slightly, offering a soft, polite, "Excuse me," and held out my hand as one passed. He didn't stop. The tray slid by me like I wasn't there. A second server passed, the flutes gleaming, pale gold bubbles catching the light. I raised my hand higher, more visibly this time, but nothing. Just a flash of motion and another missed chance. I stood still as the crowd erupted into light clinking of glasses. They were already raising them high, Garrick pausing for effect like a practiced orator. I looked down at my empty hand. No glass, no place, no surprise. I gave a little half-laugh, more breath than sound. Maybe they ran out. Maybe someone forgot. Maybe I was being paranoid. Again. Then Garrick began. "Tonight," he said, "we raise a glass not just to love, but to timing. After all, what's love without someone being on time?" There was scattered laughter. He held up his glass a little higher and turned to the crowd, eyes gleaming with showmanship. "And speaking of timing, let's all hope Celine never adopts the habits of our dear Miss Lost and Late over there." The room burst into laughter. I stood motionless, blinking through the warm sting crawling up behind my eyes. Miss Lost and Late. I hadn't heard that name aloud in years. It started during a school field trip to the zoo. I was 9, assigned to Garrick's group, and wandered off for 5 minutes to look at the sea lions. 5 minutes turned into 30 before a chaperone found me near the otter tank. When the story made its way back to dinner that night, Garrick gave me the nickname. And it stuck like gum under a desk. He used to call it out during roll call when we played house in the backyard, always giving me the role of the forgetful maid. Even when I made sergeant, he called it once on a family Zoom, like it was some hilarious relic of childhood. I'd laughed along then, but now standing here glassless and alone, it cut differently. My jaw tightened, my fingers curled around the cool fabric of my clutch. I was a guest. I had been invited, and still, I was being served ridicule on a silver platter while the rest were handed champagne. The clinks echoed again as everyone drank. I stayed frozen. A flash of memory surfaced, not from a birthday or deployment this time, but from a mundane Tuesday. I was 13. School had ended early for teacher training. I waited outside for nearly 2 hours until a janitor finally let me use the office phone. My parents had picked up Garrick from practice and driven home without realizing I wasn't in the car. That night, no one mentioned it. I hadn't either. I'd eaten dinner silently, the food tasting like cardboard. And just like now, my seat had been there, but my presence hadn't. I folded my arms across my chest. When people forget you often enough, I thought, you start erasing yourself for them. You shrink yourself down until there's no room for disappointment. The crowd around Garrick cheered again. He raised his glass higher, toasting to something about family unity and Celine's radiant future. I didn't even catch the rest. I didn't need to. I wasn't raising my glass to this lie. I turned from the circle of warmth and light and applause. My hand, still empty, disappeared into my coat pocket as I walked slowly toward the double doors that led to the patio, into the sharp chill of the Colorado night. The night air wrapped around me like an old wool blanket, scratchy, cold, but oddly comforting. I slipped off my heels, letting my feet feel the cool stone of the patio. Just for a moment, I wanted to feel something real, something that didn't require forced smiles or hollow small talk. I sat down on the bench beneath the pergola, staring out at the golf course bathed in moonlight. The firelight from inside flickered through the glass doors behind me, a warm glow that somehow felt too far away. I closed my eyes and let my head fall back against the slatted wood. Out here, the music and chatter from inside the ballroom were dulled to a soft hum. I could almost pretend I was anywhere else, anywhere but my brother's engagement party where I was a well-dressed ghost in flats. The voices started faintly at first, muffled, broken by the occasional laugh or clink of a glass. But then I heard his name, Garrick. Always flashing that military badge like it's a ticket back into the family, Garrick said, his voice sneering and unmistakably close. She's always been dramatic, came the gruffer voice of my father. Left for the Air Force and came back acting like we begged her to go. I didn't move, not even a blink. The words settled in me like sediment, slowly choking the part of me that still hoped, still made excuses for them. I mean, come on, Garrett continued. What did she expect? That we'd keep her seat warm for a decade? Their laughter cracked through the window pane, cruel and echoing. They didn't know I was here. Or maybe they did, and they didn't care. I looked down at my hands. These hands had wrapped field dressings, written condolence letters, and packed gear bags in the dead of night. They'd also washed dishes in this very home years ago while Garrick played the golden child. I never resented the work, just the way they never saw it. 100 memories tried to claw their way forward. The first time I deployed, Garrick hadn't even called. The Christmas I mailed handmade cards with sand still stuck in the envelope glue, no replies. And when Mom was in the hospital and I Skyped in, my face grainy and pixelated from a dusty barracks room, they talked over me like I was background noise. They never had to love me, but they could have respected me. I stood up. No dramatic entrance, no raised voice. I walked calmly back into the ballroom, stepping through the door like a breeze. Garrick was leaning by the hors d'oeuvres table, still sipping on champagne and basking in his own joke. I approached until he noticed me and gave that same amused smirk he always did when he thought he had the upper hand. Althea, I was just... Mock me again, I said, voice quiet but firm, and I won't be there when you say your vows. He blinked. The smirk didn't drop completely, but it twitched. Oh, come on, you know we joke. I didn't flinch. I mean it. He let out a soft, uneasy chuckle. You're serious? Deadly. I held his gaze for just a moment longer, then turned. I didn't need him to believe me. I just needed him to know I was done playing the role they assigned me. Across the room, I saw my father watching us from a few feet away. His expression was unreadable, but the way his brow furrowed said enough. He heard me. I made my way to the coat rack near the entrance. My shoes dangled from one hand, my clutch in the other. I slipped my coat over my shoulders and paused, eyes on the exit. They thought I came here to reconnect. I came here to decide. The house had quieted down. The last of the guests had left, the laughter and clinking glasses replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the foyer. I slipped off my heels, grateful to feel the cool wooden floor under my feet. I had forgotten my coat upstairs. Or maybe I just needed an excuse to be alone for 5 minutes without being looked at like a stranger in my own bloodline. Celine's old room was at the end of the hall. As I walked toward it, I heard faint laughter, the delicate rustle of silk, and a familiar melody humming low from a speaker. Something tugged at my chest. I pushed the door open quietly, expecting to find an empty room lit by memories. But what I saw pulled the breath from my lungs. Celine stood before the mirror, her hands brushing the neckline of her ivory slip dress. Around her neck glinted a deep blue, a sapphire pendant I knew too well. My grandmother's necklace. The one she had let me hold with trembling hands when I turned 16, the one she'd whispered, "This will be yours one day. You have her fire." Garrick stood behind Celine, fastening the clasp like he'd done it 100 times. His grin was wide and proud. "Fits like it was meant for you," he said. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Just stood there and let the betrayal calcify into silence. Then, as if instinctually, I turned and backed away, pulling the door shut without a creak. Down the hall, my mother appeared like a shadow made flesh. Her pearls were still perfectly aligned, not a hair out of place. "Why is Celine wearing Grandma's necklace?" I asked quietly, voice taut as fishing line before a snap. She didn't even flinch. "It suits Celine more. You wouldn't have worn it anyway." No apology, no emotion, just a sentence meant to dismiss, not explain. She promised it to me. My mother looked past me, like I wasn't worth the energy of eye contact. Promises fade, things change. It took every bit of discipline I'd learned in the Air Force not to shout, not to demand she take it back. Instead, I turned and walked. Each step heavy with rage and disbelief, a fire starting low in my belly. Outside, the night had turned cooler, wind brushing against my bare shoulders. I stopped in the driveway and looked up at the stars. Grandma would have laughed, her laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and told me to stand tall, to be louder than silence. But silence was all they gave me. 16 years old, alone on a base in Afghanistan, writing letters to her on scraps of ration boxes. I had drawn that necklace once, tucked it into the corner of my journal like a secret wish. I remembered the call when she died. I wasn't allowed leave. I wasn't there. But they told me she'd left it to me. They told me it was mine. Now I was watching them give away my inheritance like it was a party favor. Celine stepped out onto the porch, humming that same tune from the room. She looked surprised to see me standing there. Her hands instinctively went to the necklace, as if she needed to protect it. "Enjoy the necklace," I said, voice even, cold. "It's the last thing you'll get of mine without a fight." She blinked, unsure whether to smile or bristle. I didn't wait to see which she chose. The email came through just as I was stirring my coffee, the steam curling into a lazy spiral in the early morning quiet of my Denver apartment. I'd been savoring that stillness, the kind you only get before the city wakes up, before patients fill the clinic waiting room, before the weight of other people's lives lands in my hands again. I didn't expect to see Garrick's name in my inbox. Subject: Estate Logistics Final Draft. Curiosity overrode common sense. I clicked. The document was long, filled with financial language and property terms, trusts and clauses. My eyes skimmed past the jargon until one line caught me. "We'll keep Althea out of this for now. She tends to complicate things." My stomach dropped. I scrolled back, looking at the chain of replies. Celine, Mom, Dad, no CC to me. Garrick had forwarded it, probably by mistake. But the damage wasn't accidental. It had already been done, long before that email ever hit send. I read the sentence again, slower this time, like poking a bruise to confirm the pain. She tends to complicate things. What part of me was complicated? The part that served overseas? The part that wasn't content to smile politely when things were unjust? Or just the part that refused to fade into the background like they always hoped I would? The coffee had gone cold by the time I set the mug down. Sunday brunch came with sunshine and buttered scones, linen napkins, and a view of the golf course that made you forget anything could go wrong in the world, except it already had. I arrived with the printed email tucked into my purse. We were halfway through Eggs Benedict and small talk when I placed the paper gently between the salt and pepper shakers. No drama, no raised voice, just calm precision. Something I'd mastered both in triage tents and family conversations. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. Dad didn't even flinch. He dabbed his lips with his napkin, as if I'd asked about the weather. "That was never your business to begin with." Celine looked away, her fork frozen midair. Garrick smirked into his mimosa. For a second, I said nothing. The quiet didn't feel weak. It felt deliberate, like the kind you hear right before something splits open. I stood up slowly. My chair didn't scrape. I didn't slam the paper down or make a scene. I just left it there like a discarded X-ray. I walked out into the warm air, the sun making patterns through the leaves. Each step away from that table felt like reclaiming something, maybe not respect, not yet, but clarity. They never saw me as part of the future because they never accepted my past. I remembered being 14, backstage at the school play, tears smudging my makeup after forgetting a line. I'd overheard Dad say to Mom, "She's too emotional. Always has been." I'd carried that phrase like a diagnosis. I thought time, medals, and maturity would change it. But now I knew it was never about me. It was about control. They couldn't control the woman who didn't break when things got hard, so they left her out. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through contacts until I landed on my attorney. I didn't hesitate. "Hi, yeah. I'd like to set up a meeting. Estate matters." My voice didn't waver. When I got home that evening, the hallway was quiet except for the rustle of junk mail being shoved under doors. But one envelope stood out. No return address. Heavy paper. Inside was a copy of the estate's will draft, page after page filled with signatures and allocations. My name was nowhere. But that wasn't what made my breath catch. Taped to the final page was a single sticky note. "This is bigger than you think." The rain had been falling in sheets for most of the day, but now it whispered against the windows of my apartment, soft and steady. The kind of rain that makes you dig through closets, open boxes you've avoided for years, just to feel like you're reclaiming something. After finding the draft of the will, my name notably absent, I couldn't sit still. I needed to see what else had been left behind. Maybe not just by them, but by me. I was on my knees, tugging at the corner of a cardboard box buried deep in the hall closet. Dust flared with every shift. I coughed, wiped my sleeve across my nose, and pulled it free. At the bottom was something I hadn't seen in years, my mother's old sewing box. Dark green with brass edges, slightly dented on the corner. I remembered it sitting beside her rocking chair, always within reach, always closed. Curiosity nudged me. I brought it to the living room and flipped the latch. The inside smelled like cedar and lavender. Rows of thread spools lined up like little soldiers, rusted scissors, faded fabric scraps, pins that had long since lost their sharpness. I lifted the tray insert, and there it was, a false bottom, one I'd never noticed before. My fingers trembled as I slid it open. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with time, edges curled, written in my mother's looping script. "To Althea, when you're old enough to understand." I stared at it for a full minute before breaking the seal. "Althea, if you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to tell you in person. Or maybe life got in the way. It always does. You were 10 when I wrote this. Still young enough to believe in fairy tales, but old enough to notice when things don't add up. You always noticed. I wanted to leave. Not the world, not my life, but the house, the family. I had packed our bags and tucked away cash. I was going to take you, just you, because you were the only thing I had left that still felt like mine. You were the spark in all that darkness. But your father found out. He said he'd take you from me, that he'd make sure I never saw you again, that he'd ruin me, ruin you, and no one would believe a word I said. He had the lawyers, the connections, the charm. I had nothing but hope, and you. So I stayed. Not for him, not for Garrick or the show we put on for holidays. I stayed because I knew they'd crush you to prove a point, and I couldn't let that happen. I know I seemed distant, cold even. That was survival. But every letter you sent from overseas, I read them, every single one. I kept them in a shoebox under my bed, right next to the photo of you wearing my old sun hat. You always were more than they deserved, more than I could protect. But you kept going, and that's the bravest thing of all. Love, Mom. I didn't cry. I lay on the floor with that letter clutched to my chest and let the silence wrap around me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I'd been abandoned. I felt chosen. She had tried. She hadn't left because she didn't love me. She had stayed because she did. The memories of her silence, her dismissive glances all blurred into something else. Self-preservation. Defense. A strategy in a house that didn't allow softness. I'd hated her for it. But now I understood. You tried, I whispered into the quiet. And that's more than anyone else did. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into a folder I'd labeled Exhibit A. My legal case wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about truth. As I stood up, the clouds outside began to shift. A break in the rain. A small square of sunlight spread across my floor like a promise. I picked up my phone and texted my lawyer. Found something. Game might change. The courthouse had that sterilized scent, like polished wood and old dust masked by lemon cleaner. I stood at the entrance of courtroom 6B, my coat folded over my arm, the file in my hand slightly trembling, though I wished it wasn't. My lawyer, Karen, gave me a brief nod and opened the door for us. Inside, the air was heavy. Garrick and Celine were already seated, their expressions impassive, dressed for church but postured for war. Dean sat a row behind them, his tie crooked, eyes fixed on the ground. We hadn't spoken in months. I slid into the bench behind Karen, my documents pressed to my chest. Across the room, no one looked at me. That wasn't new. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The morning was procedural, objections, exhibits, timelines. I let it wash over me until Karen leaned over and whispered, "Dean's up next. Stay steady. This could go either way." I nodded, pressing my lips into a flat line. "I'm ready." Dean took the stand, his tall frame folded awkwardly in the chair. He cleared his throat once, then again when the opposing counsel began. "Mr. Wright, as the oldest sibling, were you aware of any estate planning conversations involving your father?" "Yes," he said, voice tight. "Starting about 2 years ago." "Was Althea included in those?" Dean hesitated. "No." "Why not?" "My father said she complicated things." The words didn't sting. They simply echoed. But Karen's hand tensed on her notepad. "Mr. Wright, do you recall any significant moments that would suggest tension between Althea and your parents beyond financial matters?" Dean shifted. "Then something happened I hadn't expected. One night," he began, "I was maybe 16. I came downstairs to grab a drink and Dad was in the den with the fireplace going. He didn't hear me. He glanced down. He was burning letters, crying. I asked if something was wrong. He told me they were from Mom and that I should never mention it again." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. My heartbeat faltered. I stared at him, waiting for more, but he was already withdrawing, closing up again. Karen's cross-examination was brief. She simply asked if he knew where the letters came from. He said no, but we both knew the courtroom had already shifted. When Dean stepped down, he walked past me without a glance. I didn't call after him. I didn't need to. During recess, I stepped into the hallway, finding a sliver of peace in the buzz of coffee machines and quiet murmurs. That's when I saw her, a woman in her 70s, gray curls tucked into a maroon scarf, standing with a small, worn notebook in hand. "Althea Wright?" she asked, her voice soft, but sure. "Yes?" "I'm Joan. I sang in choir with your mother, back in the day." She extended the notebook. "She gave me this years ago, told me to hold it in case you ever needed to know the truth." I stared at it, faded leather, edges curled, a pink ribbon sticking out like a whispered secret. My hands trembled as I opened the first page. May 17th, 1996. I packed the necklace today. Told Althea we'd go see the ocean soon. If Thomas finds out, it'll all fall apart. Page after page confirmed what I'd feared and needed. My mother had tried. She hadn't just endured. She had fought. For me. "Thank you," I whispered. Joan smiled, a little sad. "Your mom. She had fire. You have her eyes." Back inside, Karen added the notebook to our stack of exhibits. Her smile broke through her courtroom mask for the first time. "You just made them nervous." I exhaled, steadier than I had all week. About time someone was. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and anxiety. My fingers, White-knuckled and trembling, clutched the soft leather-bound diary that once belonged to my mother. Each page inside it was a voice she never dared to speak aloud. Today, it felt like she was in the room with me. The judge entered, and the murmurs ceased like a light switch. Even the air seemed to brace itself. I kept my eyes on the grain of the bench in front of me, refusing to look at the family seated on the opposite side. My lawyer's hand rested gently on my forearm, grounding, not guiding. The judge began to speak, but his words felt like they were traveling underwater. Legal terms blurred together until I heard the phrase I hadn't dared to hope for. Granted legal guardianship of Marigold Wright. For a moment, I wasn't breathing. The world around me went silent, like someone had turned down the volume on everything but the pounding in my chest. My eyes lifted and locked with Marigold's. She was seated in the gallery next to a social worker, her legs dangling from the seat, too short to reach the floor. Her wide, uncertain eyes held mine, and in them I saw a flicker of trust, of safety. I didn't smile. I couldn't. Not yet. Not here. I merely placed a hand on my chest and nodded to the judge. Behind me, I felt the crack in the air. Celine's sharp inhale, Garrick's subtle shift in posture, the sound of our father pushing back his chair just a bit too hard. They didn't speak. That was its own kind of noise. Outside the courthouse, the world looked different. The clouds had broken just enough to let a sliver of autumn light shine through, casting everything in soft gold. I stepped onto the sidewalk, Marigold's tiny hand wrapping instinctively around mine. She didn't say a word, but she didn't let go either. Leaves swirled at our feet, yellow, crimson, faded brown. It struck me then how healing didn't mean forgetting. Healing meant remembering in your own voice, your own way. It meant reclaiming stories that others tried to write for you and tearing out the pages they forged. Marigold looked up at me, her curls catching the breeze. "Are we going home now?" "Yes," I said simply. "We are." That night, long after Marigold had fallen asleep curled beside me on the couch, one arm tucked around a stuffed rabbit she refused to name, I lit a candle and sat at my writing desk. I pulled out a fresh piece of stationery and uncapped my pen. Not a court form, not a list, a letter. I didn't start it with "Dear Mom." It didn't feel necessary. Instead, I wrote, "I understand now. Not everything, but enough. You were cornered. You didn't run. You stayed. Maybe for me. Maybe because you had no choice. But in the end, you left something behind. A piece of truth I could build on. And now, I finally know. I am not broken. I am not lost. I am not theirs to define." I folded the letter and tucked it inside the diary, right where hers had once waited for me. Then I locked the drawer. "I don't need your answers anymore," I whispered into the silence. "I have mine." The apartment was still. Morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains Althea had rescued from a thrift shop, painting delicate shadows across the kitchen floor. She flipped the last pancake onto a plate as Marigold skipped into the room, her socks sliding slightly on the hardwood. "Auntie Althea, can we decorate for the seasons like real homes do?" The words made Althea pause mid-step. She turned to face her niece, her breath catching for a moment. Real homes. What did that even mean? For Marigold, perhaps it meant twinkle lights in winter, pumpkin garlands in October, and handmade paper hearts in February. "Of course we can," she said softly. "This is a real home." Marigold beamed, taking her plate to the table. The rhythm of their lives had settled. Mornings like this, quiet, warm, predictable, felt both foreign and sacred. Althea was still adjusting to it all, the school pickups, the steady paycheck from the community clinic, the friendships that began with small talk and slowly turned real. Therapy helped. She no longer flinched when asked to describe herself without using her rank. Elise, a fellow group member, fierce in a soft-spoken way, had become someone she texted without overthinking. Sometimes, when Althea caught herself smiling for no reason, she would still brace for something to go wrong. Trauma had trained her to flinch from peace. But the quiet kept holding. The letter arrived on a Thursday. She almost tossed it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the return address from Alaska. But something made her pause. Her name was scrawled carefully, not like junk mail. She tore it open with her thumb, Micah. Her breath hitched as she read the first line. I know I don't deserve a reply. I'm writing anyway. It wasn't a long letter, no apologies about the past, no defenses of their father, just a few lines about how he'd spent the last decade off the grid, and then the twist. A woman runs the quilting circle in this town. She goes by Margaret, but she looks like Mom. Same scar on the wrist, same eyes. She didn't recognize me, or maybe she pretended not to. Thought you should know. Inside the envelope was a photo. The woman sat on a wooden porch, holding a hand-stitched quilt in her lap. Her hair was gray at the temples, her shoulders slumped but strong. Even from grainy pixels, Althea knew it was her. Beneath the photo, scribbled, "She doesn't have long. If you want answers, come." That night, after Marigold had fallen asleep with a flashlight and her favorite book under the blanket, Althea sat with Elise on the back porch. "Do you think closure's a myth?" she asked, her voice quiet. Elise exhaled slowly, sipping her tea. "I think silence is worse." Later, Althea lay awake, the letter on her nightstand, the old diary open beside it. Her fingers hovered over the photo again and again, as if by touching it she could change the past. She booked a ticket at 2:14 a.m. Packing wasn't dramatic, just thermal clothes, gloves, her mother's diary, and the photo tucked into a side pocket. When Marigold asked where she was going, Althea knelt and looked her in the eyes. "To find something I never had a chance to understand, but I'll be back. This is home now." The girl nodded solemnly, as if understanding more than her years allowed. Before leaving, Althea stood by the door, suitcase in hand. She wasn't chasing love or revenge, just truth. And this time, she wasn't running from anything. She was walking towards something. "Whatever I find there, I'll still come back here. That's the difference now. I have somewhere to return to." The cold hit me like a memory, sharp, undeniable, and oddly grounding. Nome wasn't a place people stumbled into. You had to want to be there. The moment I stepped off the regional flight and felt the wind whip across the tarmac, I understood why. The airport was little more than a converted barn, and yet it hummed with a quiet energy, tight-knit, sealed off, and not meant for outsiders. I clutched the slip of paper Micah had mailed me, an address, barely legible, smeared slightly from the rain back home. I didn't need GPS. The woman at the rental desk took one look at it and handed me keys to a battered pickup with snow chains already fitted. "You're going up to Greta's?" she asked, not judging, just stating a fact. I nodded. "Tell her I said hi," she added, then paused. "And, take it slow. Roads can surprise you this time of year." I didn't ask what she meant, I just drove. The cabin appeared after 20 silent miles. Pine trees stood like sentinels, limbs heavy with snow. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was home. Greta opened the door before I could knock. Her hair was braided like my mother's used to be. Her eyes glistened. "Sweetheart," she whispered, pulling me into a hug that confused my senses. Her embrace smelled of lavender and dust. Too familiar, too foreign. "I remember everything," she said into my hair. "You've grown into your mother's courage." Inside, the fire crackled. A teapot hissed gently. Photos lined the mantel, all new, all suspiciously curated. None of them included me. Over chamomile tea, she began to talk. She mentioned the red dress I wore at 8, the time I hid under the table during a thunderstorm, the bracelet I broke in church. But my mother had never known those things. At least, not firsthand. They were things I had told others. I narrowed my eyes. "How do you know all that?" Her hand trembled slightly, tea sloshing. She exhaled. "Because I wasn't your mother, Althea. I was her friend. Her nurse at first. Later, her companion." The room spun, but I didn't flinch. "She died over a decade ago," Greta said quietly. But before she passed, she made me promise, if you ever came, give you this. From a drawer under the hearth, she pulled out a box wrapped in faded blue cloth. Inside, a letter addressed in my mother's handwriting, a pressed bluebell, and a torn journal page. For Althea, if she ever comes. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My body felt hollowed, but oddly relieved. The truth had finally taken a shape. Micah came that evening, older, sober. His face gaunt but his eyes familiar. I'm sorry, he said before I could ask. I thought if I told you, it would break you. I stared at him. What broke me was the silence. He nodded. She was sick, Al, not just physically. She thought they were listening, watching. She thought they'd come for you if she stayed close. And you believed her? I didn't know what to believe. I was 19 and scared. So I ran. We sat for hours, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. The next morning I stood at the icy edge of the world, the Bering Sea stretched out, endless and gray. I read the letter aloud, voice shaking but steady. You didn't abandon me. You tried, I whispered. And now I'm done carrying the weight of what might have been. I folded the letter gently, placed it back in the box, and held it close. Not as evidence, as proof. I'll go back home. To Marigold. To the life I've begun building with steadier hands. But first, I walk through this frozen town. Not to chase ghosts. To meet the living. I woke before dawn in Nome. The motel heater humming softly as I reread my mother's final letter one last time. Her words held the fierce clarity that had guided me here, and now I realized they demanded action. There was something I had missed, something hidden beneath the journal and the keepsakes. As the first pale light filtered through the thin curtains, I opened the box's secret compartment. Inside, tucked beneath the leather-bound journal, were coded receipts, faintly pressed coordinates, and a list of names. Small print details that revealed a terrifying truth. Greta wasn't just a lonely companion. She was part of a network, one trading abandoned children, Althea's included, to the highest bidder. My hands didn't tremble. Calm fury steadied my grip. This wouldn't end in despair. It would end in reckoning. When Greta's cabin came into view again, my heart beat steady. I carried only the essentials, the recording device hidden in my sweater, my mother's letter clutched in the other hand. Greta answered immediately, opening the door with that same tender warmth. But the second our eyes met, I saw the shift, her smile faltering. I stepped in. You said you were protecting me, I began, voice soft but sharp. Let me hear it from you. Greta's chest tightened. Her lips curled into a fragile facade. I did what I had to. I took your place. I saved you from the life she was starting to believe you were destined for. Her voice cracked. Perfect. I clicked record. When she twisted the narrative, portraying herself as a savior, I stopped her with the recording. Listen. I pressed play. A tremor ran through her. In her own voice, she and Micah talked about keeping you in the dark so you'd never ask questions. That was all I needed. I retrieved the journal, the letters, the final journal page, the one she had pressed into the keepsake box. With a single breath, I poured gasoline across the floor, the table, her staged memories. The scent of musk and oil rose, heavy and promising. I struck a match. Flames consumed the lies. Greta watched, horrified, as smoke swirled. She appeared for a moment, lost, fearful, and then vanished into the white wilderness beyond. I stayed, sending copies of the evidence to journalists and local law enforcement before the fire took the whole memory to ash. Days later, Nome's law enforcement raided a derelict barn matching the coordinates. Inside, hidden under rotting hay, they found bundles, identification papers, small toys, paperwork tracking child transfers. The network shattered. Micah attempted to flee, forged passport in hand. They caught him at the border. He looked old and hollow and relieved. Greta was gone. I didn't need to watch her face judgment. Justice pursued the darkness she left behind. Back in Seattle, I stepped onto my rooftop one evening as spring's first light softened the edges of the city. I had applied to become a licensed trauma counselor, ready to help others heal when the world's truth burned them raw. There are storms you survive, and there are fires you ensure never rise again. I breathed deep. I was remade, by grief, by truth, and now, by hope. After everything I've been through, if there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Healing is not about erasing the past. It's about owning it. Every scar, every silence, every shadow was part of a journey that led me here. Not broken, but forged. To anyone listening who feels forgotten, overlooked, or dismissed, you are not invisible. You don't have to be what they called you. You don't have to carry the shame others handed you. You can choose when your story begins again. I did. And I promise, the view from the other side of survival is worth it. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the one left out of the story? Or maybe you're still carrying the weight of someone else's silence. What would you say if you had one chance to speak up? Share it with me in the comments. This is a space for real stories, real voices. If this story moved you, if it hit something deep, drop a 1 in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. If it didn't connect with you, I still want to hear why. Your voice matters here. And hey, if you're just discovering this channel, welcome. If you felt something real while watching, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories coming that will meet you right where you are, raw, real, and ready to remind you you're not alone. Thanks for being here. Let's keep growing together.